Now, away from the shores of Africa, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and U.K. Foreign Secretary David Lammy are hosting a high-level meeting of national security advisors on Saturday to discuss the ongoing war in Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has firmly stated that peace talks without Kiev's participation will achieve nothing. This comes ahead of a planned meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska on Friday. However, Zelensky reaffirmed he will not cede any Ukrainian land to Russia, contradicting Trump's suggestion that territorial swaps might be part of a peace deal. Fighting continues on the ground, with both Moscow and Kiev reporting drone strikes. Russia currently controls about 20% of Ukrainian territory, and Kiev shows little willingness to accept peace on unfavorable terms. Now, to discuss this, we're joined by international policy analyst Bolu Michael-Biyi. He joins us from Swaziland in Eswatini. Bolu, thank you for joining us. Now, with Vice President J.D. Vance and Foreign Secretary David Lammy hosting a high-level meeting today, what should be expected from the outcome of this meeting?
All right, thank you very much for having me. I expect that the meeting will produce a shared statement or a coordinated response or talking point that signals a united US, UK, EU position ahead of the meeting in Alaska. So what I'm trying to say is that it is likely we see a coordinated we won't see a binding deal, but a coordinated diplomatic move. Advisors they're likely to compare notes in terms of intelligence and contingency plans, which could include things like options like sanctions, military aid, or even diplomatic move, so that they'll be very well prepared. In case of instances whereby Ukraine is excluded from the talk, they will want to ensure as much as possible that Ukraine remains the central point of any discussion. They're involved as much as possible. So I don't expect that the meeting of these advisors will build any major process or posture, because they rarely do. When we look at precedents, meetings like this, they don't really produce any major concession or a sudden on the ground move or policy change, but it creates a process or a posture for future progress.
Now, President Zelensky has rejected peace talks and, of course, talks that exclude Ukraine from reaffirmed, he has said that he will not cede any territory. How does this stance, complicate potential peace negotiations, especially in the light of Trump's suggestion of territorial swaps?
Well, if we look at what is on ground now, citizens of Ukraine, even their leaders, will not agree to a territorial swap. That's one thing that Ukrainians at every level of government, or even outside government, that's one thing that every citizen of Ukraine kind of agree on. So I believe that any deal that is reached, without Ukraine being involved, there's a risk of it being illegitimate, and it's going to be condemned by even allies of some allies of Russia. I wouldn't be surprised, because it's just illegitimate on every ground. That will make the enforcement of such decision and buy-in to be very hard. And President Zelensky has made it clear that Ukraine must be at the table, Ukraine must be part of the decision-making process, and I totally agree with him. I think any responsible leader would want to be at the table to make decisions about the concerns of their own people. So asking Ukraine to cede the land or part of their territory is just crossing the red line for most Ukrainians, and such kind of thing would reduce any chance of a compromise in any way. So with Ukraine refusing to make any concessions, the negotiator will face a huge gap that they have to fill. Russia is aiming to expand their territory. Ukraine, on the other hand, is demanding for full sovereignty. So that gap makes quick bargains to be very unlikely.
Now, what is the significance of the upcoming Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska, and do you see it affecting the current diplomatic efforts by the U.S. and the U.K.?
Well, I think it's quite symbolic, but I don't think it's going to lead to any immediate policy change. A direct Trump-Putin meeting, of course, is high profile. These are, the leaders of two major countries, Trump countries in the world, and you can shift the narrative of the war in a very huge way. But any progress needs Ukraine to be present. Any progress needs Ukraine to be at the table, and they must give them, some form of guarantees before they can actually, make any compromise or compromise in any way. So the summit is likely to produce several ideas. Land swap, I know, is definitely on the table according to Trump, but Ukraine will reject it. The allies will reject it. It could force the US and UK to spend their energy trying to repair the unity rather than moving to any major policy change. And lastly, it could affect diplomatic tempo all around on the war. Even if it doesn't deliver a particular deal, it can accelerate the talks. It can signal that progress can be made and the countermeasures can be put in place. So the US, UK, and Ukraine advisor meeting, it's partly damage control, in my own opinion, and it's like preparing the stage for a major fallout. Hopefully that doesn't happen.
Now, given that Russia still controls around 20% of Ukrainian territory, how likely is it that we'll see a military shift on the ground, in the coming months, or should we accept the fact that stalemate is now, a new normal?
Well, if you consider recent data, it's showing that Russia is gaining some ground, in the recent weeks. But then Ukraine is not sleeping, so which means that the battlefronts are still being contested by both Russia and Ukraine. Both sides, we're seeing them increasing their drone activity, their missile activity as well, and their adapting their tactics based on the terrain that they're in, and that favors slow local advances rather than a sweeping offensive. The outcome of all this depends on the external support that both countries receive from their allies, and also the logistics involved. So this shift will hinge on the weapons, the ammunition being used, and the air defense supplies that they're getting, and also the political will from their backers, their allies. So without any major input from these people, from their allies, and even the two countries, that's Russia and Ukraine, we should expect a continued war, friction or attrition, from both parties.
All right, man, thanks to you, B. Michael, for having this conversation with us.
Thank you for having me.